Welcome to my channel HFY Epic Narratives. Don't forget to like and subscribe. They found him first by the smell of scorched copper and sea salt metal, a human silhouette hunched beside the broken throat of an alien pod like a moth at the edge of a dying lamp. The world around them exhaled in long, slow ribbons of golden haze. Metal dust hung in the air and caught the late sunset light so that every particle looked deliberate, like confetti for the end of something important. The observatory ruins behind them were ribbed and whaleboned, half swallowed by wind-sculpted dunes that sang when the air moved. It was a planet that wore its history on its skin, rusted plates, glass bloom gardens, and a sky that took its time deciding whether to be beautiful or dangerous. He called himself Jonah Myles. He'd been a cargo engineer for 8 years, patching ships together with hope and chewing gum, which on some days were the same thing. He smelled of oil and old coffee. His hands looked like maps of the places he'd fixed. Clipped to his chest was a scorched steel badge, dented, blackened around the edges, given to him for a rescue nobody wanted to remember. He kept it under his shirt when it mattered and wore it on the outside when he wanted to remind himself why he kept walking. She was Commander Kahri Vesh of the 7th Deep Watch, and the pod beside Jonah had been her command escape vehicle. Kahri was tall in the way that glacier stones are tall, imposing if you stared too long, but built of slow kindness if you listened. Her skin was a matrix of pearlescent scales that shifted color like late autumn on a tide. Her face had the knife-edge geometry of a species designed to study angles. Small bioluminescent filaments traced the bones of her neck and wrists, lighting her like the inside of a cathedral. Her uniform was braided with rank and loss. The emblem of her fleet had curled away in the heat of the crash. When Jonah first lifted the pod's access collar, the alarm circuits coughed and died like neighborhood dogs. He worked with the practiced calm of someone who had turned improvisation into a profession. He hummed a warbling tune under his breath, fingers moving through alien joints and seals. The biosuit folded back and shivered. Kahri's eyes opened slowly, like a tide pulling back to reveal new shorelines. She watched him sleep that first night. Not because she was cruel. Not because she wanted to catalog his habits. She watched because when she rose through the pod's vestibule the world was too loud and the crash had shaken the framework of certainties she'd traveled by. Jonah lay curled in a sleeping bag clinging to the inside of a battered cargo crate, one hand on the scorched badge where it peeked through his shirt like a heart. He breathed in shallow rasps, the breath of a man who learned to rest between alarms. The flicker of his biosuit's field, patched with straps and dented plates, glowed faint and steady. Trust in a thing you could see, fragile in the way some truths are. It flickered, then steadied. Kahri's fingers, dangerous and precise, touched the outer seam of his sleeve before she remembered that permission was a thing humans valued. "Why are you so fragile?" she asked, softly, in a language Jonah did not understand. It was later, in the broken grammar of the translator mesh, that question came across right. But in the raw night it arrived as a tune of curiosity. Jonah woke at the sound of her voice, at first confused, then sheepish, then amused. His eyes were rimmed with oil and the moonlight had placed a silver blade along his cheek. He smiled, the way people do when they are taught how to be seen. "Fragile," he said. His voice was humor and apology. "Buddy, I'm not fragile. I'm reparable." Kahri's filament cheeks lit with an expression close to what humans called skepticism. She sat beside him on the crate, maintaining that slight distance of formality that commanders carry like armor. Then she leaned in anyway. Knowledges are contagious. Jonah mistrusted Kahri because she was an officer of a species that had once blockaded a human colony for 3 weeks over a misunderstanding fueled by a translator error and a stupid local governor. Kahri mistrusted Jonah because humans were the species who most often fixed things with duct tape and prayer. Both had preconceptions like scars, shaping, classifying, but also fragile under fresh light. They traded stories in clipped fragments. Jonah told her about the cargo line, how metal had felt different on different worlds, how a good weld could hum like an old lover. Kahri told him about watchships and coordinates and the weight of command, how guilt attached to every decision and never let go. Small vulnerable lines punctured the formalities. "You ever fear that the sky will fall?" Kahri asked once, while Jonah worked a soldering iron across an alien microvalve. Every morning, Jonah said. Then I drink coffee and the sky doesn't fall. It's very inconsiderate. He laughed, a tiny sharp sound. She tried to mimic it and ended up making a sound like pebbles rolling. They both liked it. Their world, Nauralys, curated its own myths. The winds carried metallic dust, reflective, like the inside of pocket watches. When sunset came, it poured across the dunes in liquid bronze, tinting everything with melancholy and promise. The observatory ruins were strewn with glass bloom gardens, fossilized growths of silica and algae that caught the long light and refracted it into shards of color. In the silence between storms those shards sang. Kahri told Jonah about them as if she were reading his poem. Trust did not arrive as a sudden conversion. It arrived in small measurable things. Jonah would set down his hand on a delicate alien panel and Kahri would pull back her tended fingers to let him hold it. She would watch him work, and instead of stepping in with corrections, she would murmur observations like prayers. "You do it like you are trying not to hurt it," she said once. Jonah, who had soldered his way out of 1,000 emergencies, found himself tender under the evaluation. Their shared survival, the second arc, began when the first storm hit. On Nauralys, storms were not water, they were woven from electromoss and static and the sharp taste of ozone. They came in sheets, in electric vines that dragged the sky down toward the ground. The pod's hull, kneaded by the crash, acted like a copper bell full of emptiness and would not protect long. They ran. Jonah cried for his left leg, which had taken a shrapnel kiss in the crash. Kahri scooped him up with a shamefaced efficiency that made him laugh even through the teeth of pain. She carried him across dunes and through glass forests whose petals whistled songcuts as static lightning threaded them. The flickering biosuit on Jonah's arm stuttered. The field that kept his core temperature steady and patched shallow hemorrhages hiccuped like a candle in a draft. They took shelter under the ribs of the observatory, a curved arching spine that had once looked toward a different star. The storm was a raw animal outside, tearing at the bones of the world. Inside, Jonah's suit flickered between warm hum and deathly blue. Kahri's hand, when it reached for his, was steady. Her fingers clockwise the old plug of the biosuit, reordering wires like someone who wrote symphonies out of technology. "You save many people?" Jonah asked, half trying to reassure himself more than her. Kahri's laugh was small. "Not enough," she said. "That is the problem." That line landed like a stone. Jonah felt the exact shape of it in his chest, the sting of not being enough and the arrogance of thinking anyone ever was. They talked then, small confessions in the way survivors do. She said she had a daughter once, a detail she let fall and then shielded. He said he had a sister who had never let him fold into defeat again. Human and alien emotions collided here, fear, humor, care, not in an attempt to align but to understand the differences. Trust deepened in tiny mechanical acts. Jonah rerouted a failing coolant line through a conduit he fabricated out of a field-stripped antenna and a strip of clothing. The scorched steel badge, which he had tucked into his shirt during the work, warmed under his ribs and he felt courage burn like a furnace. Kahri saw the badge and asked about the dent. Jonah told her a story about a station fire and a hatch that would not open, and how 30 people walked out because someone pried it with bare hands. He said it like it was an old joke. "You humans are reckless with yourself," Kahri said later, watching the badge in the dark. "And you aliens are reckless with others," Jonah replied. "We balance each other out." They were balancing each other out when the rising action turned sharply. The pod's AI pendant, an old, broken charm Jonah had fished from the wreck and affixed to Kahri's suit, was more than decoration. It held fragments of the pod's mapping software, a little memory engine with a ridiculous personality module that Jonah had coaxed back into life with duct tape and a code whisper. It kept stuttering and then sparked, its little hollow eyes blinking like a dying star. It had become, in their little microcosm of ruin, a symbol of hope reborn, the broken AI pendant. During the storm, the pendant kept them laughing. It told jokes it had been taught in 6 languages, sang lullabies, and once recited a poem in a tongue neither of them understood but both liked anyway. It became the fragile thing they smuggled into their pockets, proof that even broken technology harbored the stubborn impulse to try again. It was under that fragile charm and the flickering biosuit that they survived a night of terrors. Monsters in the dunes, small, fast predators evolved to follow the electric scent left in the storm, scraped at the ribs. Kahri aimed a non-lethal pulse that put them to sleep in a heap of slithering bodies. Jonah patched his leg over Kahri's shoulder, a human leaning into alien hands with a trust that was not reckless but chosen. They whispered to each other as if whispering could rebuild the universe. Humor threaded through the dangerous work like a machine oil that lubricated heavy gears. "If my leg falls off," Jonah joked, voice flat, "promise me you'll keep the badge. It looks like it belongs to someone who knows how to die stylishly." Kahri's filament cheeks warmed like coals. "I will return it," she said. "But only if you teach me how to swear in your language." His laughter came out of him clean and bright. "Only if you teach me to read the stars like you do." These were not grand statements of union, they were small promises. They were practice for trust. The pod's distress beacon, which had been buried under twisted hull and torrential patterning, finally sent a signal that was too important to be ignored. Enemy patrols, a fleet of watchers from a third party who saw the crash as opportunity, had triangulated the faint emission and were converging on the observatory. Kahri's ship had been part of a convoy escorting a human colony vessel. The watchers had reasons to keep both factions separate and fearful. Ironically, it was now Jonah and Kahri who stood between those reasons and a truce. The watchers arrived like a cut in the world, sleek ships, clinical in their panic, bearing weapons that read like questions in a dead language. The observatory's ribs threw long, accusing shadows as they descended. Jonah and Kahri had seconds to decide whether to fight or flee. "Run," Jonah said first, and in his voice there was a criminal refusal. He saw the scorched badge on his chest as if it belonged to somebody else. The biosuit flickered, the light catching in its seams. Somewhere in the sky the pendant hummed like a bird. "We will not leave the pod," Kahri said. Command frames in her voice. But when she looked at Jonah, she was not playing commander. She was human. "There's a route through the glass bloom," Jonah said. "It will lead to a sink of dry air. We can get you to a calm array. They can triangulate a pickup." "You will not come," Kahri replied. He shrugged, that small human gesture of false indifference. "I'm already tired of being told not to come." The enemy fire lit and the world answered. Splinters of observatory glass shattered like 1,000 interstellar hearts. Jonah moved because it was the natural thing to do. He stepped between Kahri and the first line of fire. The scorched steel badge, which had grown comfortable at the center of his chest, flared in the light an ugly comet hue. The biosuit on his arm buzzed and then blinked out. The flicker that had once been a symbol of trust stumbled like a lantern hit by wind. Kahri moved with the fluid precision of someone trained to be a shield. She pushed him down, palms on his chest, and for a moment their faces were close, so close he could see the pattern of her filaments and the tiny scar that chewed a silver line from her jaw to her ear. She tasted like ozone and old sea salts. He could feel the cadence of her breath against his lips, a rhythm that made him dizzy. In the ribbed shadow of the observatory, enemy fire carved the air like knives. "Get up," she hissed, translated breath between teeth. "We cannot both die like this." He had time, there, in that tight throat of a breath, to measure everything. The broken pendant was clutched in her hand. Kahri had saved it earlier from Jonah's pocket. The pendant emitted a flickering light like a dying moth. Jonah thought of the people who had walked through a hatch because he pried it open. He thought of a daughter he had never seen but whose outline he carried in the way he loved small things. He thought of how often he had been called fragile. He chose, in that instant, with the simplicity of someone who had learned the arithmetic of love. He pushed himself forward, palms wanting to take the place Kahri had held, to be the mortar in which she could stand. A round caught his shoulder and he felt it like a translation error, sharp and incorrect. He tasted iron and something like apology. The scorched badge shattered against the metal of the observatory's spine. It fell from his chest, a thin broken arc of steel that scraped the ground and spun away. Kahri's scream, an animal sound shaped into a soldier's geometry, filled the observatory. The pendant, slipped from her hand by the force of the blast, landed on Jonah's palm. Its broken face blinked and then, impossibly, steadied. It projected a single image, a memory loop of home, blue waves and a small, laughing child running on a beach. For an alien commander and a human cargo engineer, the image was an unauthorized translation of why anyone did anything. It was hope reconstituted. They held each other then, not as commander and subordinate nor as alien and human, but as two beings who had chosen the same small, sacred defiance. Kahri gathered Jonah up and heaved him like someone lifting a promise into place. She strapped him into the pod as if willing him into the next heartbeat. The biosuit gave a last, valiant flicker and then steadied, the trust reconstituted, like something forgiven. "Why are you so fragile?" Kahri had asked, months ago, watching him sleep. Jonah, bleeding and grinning, answered now in a language that did not require translation. "Because I choose to be," he said. "Because being fragile means we can break and still need someone to hold us." Kahri looked at him then with a brightness that was almost pain. "You teach me new words for weight," she said. "And old words for mercy." A firefight raged outside. Jonah and Kahri, in the cramped heat of the pod, pressed against each other with the intimacy of people who have just learned where they begin and where the other ends. They had no illusions about every rescue ending in romance. They had only certainty about the rightness of small revolts, the saving of a hand, the lending of a shoulder, the sharing of a joke during a storm. Yet now, with the world screaming around their hull, something else unfurled, a kind of love that was equal parts stubbornness and surrender. Kahri made a decision that would rewrite both their trajectories. She keyed the pod's emergency transponder into a loop that would confuse the enemy's lock for long enough to pull them out in a targeted corridor. She rerouted power into the pod's shield, diverting the energy through the broken AI pendant which, by now, was integrated enough to act as an auxiliary stabilizer. The shield shimmered like a prayer. "You cannot pilot and command both," Jonah murmured, his voice a brittle thread. "This is on you." "You are wrong," Kahri said. "This was always on both of us." She kissed him then, once, in that slapdash, dangerous way that says more than vows. It was not an act of finality but of accusation. "You have made me better than I was." It was soft and early and ruined him for any other sort of night. The rescue corridor opened because Kahri defined it with logic and the pendant sang the right vowels into the enemy's lock. A human salvage ship, drawn by the beacon Jonah had managed to reconfigure in a last burst of wit, nicked the edge of the cluster of ships and took them out like a cliff-snatching net. Jonah and Kahri were not saved cleanly. The pod limped tow-line to the salvage vessel, slung between rocks of flame and shadow. Jonah's arm hung limp, his chest bore a weight of new stories. Kahri's uniform was torn, filaments singed, a rank ribbon dangling like a prayer flag. They limped into a hospital bay on a recovery station that smelled faintly of lemon and boiled metal. It was here, under fluorescent lights too white for the golden haze of Nauralys, that the full measure of their closeness unrolled. Small dialogues punctured the clinical air. "Will this leave a scar?" Jonah asked, eyes half closed. "Every scar will be a map," Kahri said. "You will never know the route unless you look." Jonah tried to make a joke and failed. "You've turned me into a walking atlas." "You are an atlas," she said, "for whatever universe wants mapping." She reached out, fingers light and determined, and fixed the broken AI pendant around Jonah's throat. It hung between them like a small, ridiculous miracle. The pendant's little holographic eye blinked awake and then projected, for both of them, a field of stars. Kahri traced a path with her finger, no coordinate, no tactical advantage, simply a star pattern her species used to mark home. "You are not fragile," Kahri told him quietly, without ceremony. She spoke in her own language, letting the translator only do the heavy lifting for others. "You are a container for unexpected tenderness." Jonah laughed then in a way that made them both wet with memory. That's the nicest insult I've ever been told. Their bond did not become a perfect alignment of values. They argued later about policy, about the strategic stubbornness of the interstellar coalition, about who had the right to sanction and who to forgive. Their arguments were honest and intimate. They held the same ferocity for each other in those moments as they had for the storm. Jonah had a wry human irony, Kahri a quiet defiance. They found, in the friction, a kind of polishing. The salvage ship dropped them back on the ruined observatory for reasons both practical and sentimental. The sky over Nauralys that night clenched into a new ceremony. Twin auroras rose like fingers of emerald and gold, brushing the horizon with something akin to forgiveness. The observatory wake was littered with the detritus of war, torn panels, a net of twisted copper, the scorched steel badge, now a small beautiful crescent of black metal lying in the glass bloom like a fossil of courage. Jonah and Kahri stood on a back dune, a silhouette against the aurora, the flickering biosuit humming quietly. The broken AI pendant was whole now in the way the world had been repaired. It hung between his neck and her chest in equal measure, both of them touching it as if to remember that hope could indeed be reborn. They spoke, at last, with the intimacy of two people who had measured their shared mortality. "If you go back to command," Jonah said, "will you remember why you fought?" Kahri's filaments shivered like a smile. "I will remember you," she said. "And I will remember the smell of coffee and how you hide your fear in jokes." "You are going to make terrible puns," Jonah said, pretending to be indignant. "I will," Kahri hesitated. "I will use them in my after-action reports." He reached down then and picked up the scorched steel badge. It was lighter than he expected, and the dent was a little sharper. He pressed it into Kahri's palm. For a long instant she looked as if she might refuse. Then she closed her fingers around it like someone who understood that tokens do not make courage, they keep it honest in the lopsided hours. "You do not need a badge," Jonah said. "Neither do you," Kahri replied. "But it looks good on both of us." They laughed, small and human and alien together. The planet's auroras swirled, and at that moment something in the sky snapped into a pattern, a solar wind dance that the salvage crew later called the Nauralys echo. The pendant hummed with it, projection flaring to show a tiny image, a bridge between stars. It was not prophecy but possibility. Their parting came like sea foam. Kahri's ship, repaired with the tender efficiency of engineers who see poetry in duty, waited like a gray gull at the horizon. Jonah chose to stay on Nauralys for a while. There were observatory bones to be picked clean, panels to repurpose, people to help. He and Kahri traded small vows that were not binding so much as combustible. "Find me in the stars," Kahri said. "Find me in the coffee stations," Jonah replied. "I'll be the one swearing at the espresso machine." She smiled, a light that made him feel exposed and brave. She strapped on the scorched steel badge as if it were a medal of someone who had learned to love with hands. Jonah fixed the flickering biosuit one more time, a ritual of trust, and slid the broken AI pendant back around his neck. Then they parted. Kahri's ship arced away like a tide receding. Jonah watched until she was a pale slit against the auroras. The observatory hummed, the glass blooms sang a brittle farewell, and the planet breathed down into its dunes. The ending was not a tidy redemption. Jonah would limp for a while and laugh more than he used to. Kahri would go on to command and to make decisions that would haunt her and that she would carry with a fierce grace. They would both carry the memory of a shared emergency, the sound of a pendant singing, the way a badge burned in the dark, the time a biosuit flickered and held. Their humor and tenderness would be rumors across fleet corridors, small legends about how an engineer with a cracked heart taught a commander to hold something gentle. The broken AI pendant, newly healed, nestled in the sand at the observatory's foot. It glows faintly under the twin auroral fingers, hope reborn in the dust of their world. Above it, the sky draws a line that will be told and retold over meals and radio static, a story of a human who chose to be fragile and an alien commander who chose to keep him that way because she had learned that mercy is the rarest sort of courage. They did not become the same. They did not align into a single ideology or a predictable romance. Their emotions collided in the hot, honest way of planetary plates, creating mountain ranges and rifts and sometimes new continents. They learned from each other, loved in the narrow, fierce fashion of people who have seen the edge and decided to dance there for a little while. Ona would not grow less fragile, nor Kahri less fierce. Instead, they folded fragility and ferocity into a single act, the decision to be present for the other, to make shelter from grief, to be tender when the world asks for steel. The blue light of the pendant winked once more, then steadied into a slow glow. He did not fight to win, he fought to remind the stars what mercy looked like.